The Founder of Demonic Cultivation. An English translation by Fan EE 33. Read by Luna Minerva. Chapter 29. Morning Dew, Part 3. One day, the chief of the Xue Yang Chang clan, Chang, had taken some of his clan members out for a night hunt. A little over half a month into the expedition, he abruptly received news of the calamity while on the road and rushed back home. After mourning the dead, he only managed to discover that someone had maliciously broken through his house's protection spells and released a horde of savage, evil spirits inside. However, the rest of the event was wrapped in impenetrable fog. In the past, news of disaster befalling small clans would spread only to a limited number of people, but the circumstances surrounding the Xue Yang Chang clan massacre were unusual. As the curtain had long fallen on the Sunshot campaign and the siege of the burial mounds had just concluded, the cultivation world had, with great difficulty, finally achieved peace, at least on the surface. But suddenly, news of this new disaster had struck. Immediately, all of the clans were in an uproar, and terrifying rumors that the yearling Laozi Wei Wuxian had returned to the mortal world for revenge began swirling. And since no evidence had been found, they couldn't even start pursuing the true murderer. Of course, Xiao Xingchen did not idly stand by. He immediately volunteered to solve the case and seek the truth for Chang. 1 month later, he finally found the culprit of the massacre. The culprit's name was Xue Yang. This Xue Yang was even younger than Xiao Xingchen. Indeed, he was no more than a boy. However, because of the ghastliness of his crime, no one was interested in showing him mercy merely on the basis of his young age. He had been hanging around Kuei-zhou from the age of 15, making a name for himself far and wide as a major delinquent, known for his ear-to-ear grin, cruel character, and sadistic methods. Everyone in Kuei-zhou grew pale when they spoke of him. He had been a homeless street orphan as a child, and in that time, he seemed to have developed some deep-seated hatred for Chang Ping's father, which he never forgot despite the years that passed. The massacre stemmed from his desire for vengeance, among other things. After Xiao Xingchen had uncovered the truth, he traveled across 3 provinces to capture the, as yet, free and unfettered Xue Yang, who was still gleefully engaged in his favorite activity of picking fights. Taking advantage of the Lan Wangji clan's ongoing discussion conference, where the major clans were meeting to discuss cultivation and governance, Xiao Xingchen brought Xue Yang to Jinlin Terrace and recounted the events of the massacre in detail from start to finish before requesting severe punishment. Xiao Xingchen had lined up the evidence so the facts were clear as day, and the vast majority of clans had no objections. Only one clan adamantly dissented, the Lan Wangji clan. Objecting under those circumstances is asking for a torrent of criticism to come pouring onto you, Wei Wuxian said. Was this Xue Yang some kind of favorite of Jin Guangshan's?
A guest disciple,
Lan Wangji replied. He was a guest disciple? At that point, the Lan Wangji clan was already the most prominent of the 4 great clans, wasn't it? Why would they ask a hooligan to be their guest disciple?
This is related to the second connection between you and this case,
Lan Wangji said. He gazed into Wei Wuxian's eyes and slowly said,
The reason is the yin tiger tally.
Wei Wuxian's heart leapt into midair. These 3 words, yin tiger tally, were intimately familiar to him. Indeed, no one was more familiar with them than him. It was the most terrifying of all the cultivation treasures he had forged in his previous life, and, simultaneously, the most desired. Tiger tallies were used to command armies, and as the name implied, someone who held the Yin Tiger tally could use it to lead an army of corpses and spirits, as it forced them to listen to the wielder's orders. Back when Wei Wuxian had created it, he hadn't thought too deeply about the whole thing. If he were to take control of the ghost using solely his own spirit, he was bound to get tired. Then he remembered a very rare piece of spirit-infused iron, which he had happened to come across inside a monster's abdomen, retrieved it, and forged it into a tiger tally. But once the Yin Tiger tally was created, Wei Wuxian realized that something was very wrong after using it just once. The power of the Yin Tiger tally had far exceeded his original expectations. He had merely wanted it for assistance, but who could have guessed it would turn out so mighty it would almost triumph over its creator? Moreover, it did not recognize a master. In other words, as long as it was in someone's possession, no matter who they were, whether they were virtuous or vile, or friend or foe, that person would be able to use it. It wasn't as though Wei Wuxian, after forging such calamity, had refused to destroy it. However, creating the thing had been difficult enough. Destroying it was every bit as difficult, and demanded an incredible amount of his time and energy. Moreover, by then, he already vaguely sensed that his own situation was precarious, and sooner or later, everyone would turn on him. The immense power of the Yin Tiger tally meant that no one dared touch him while he was wielding it. Thus, Wei Wuxian kept it for the time being. He only split the tally into two, so that anyone attempting to use it would first have to put both pieces together. Furthermore, he decided never to use it without thinking carefully through the consequences. In all, he only ever used it 2 times, and both times it shed rivers of blood. The first was during the Sunshot campaign, and after the second time, he finally found the determination to destroy it. One half he completely obliterated, but before he was able to finish disposing of the other, the siege of the burial mounds descended upon him. He had no control over the events that followed. Wei Wuxian knew enough to say a few things about his own creations. He felt confident that, even if a clan had stolen the remaining half of the Yin Tiger tally, even if they built a shrine for it and lit incense and kneeled before it in worship every single day, without the other half, it was no more than scrap metal. But Lan Wangji now told him something astonishing. This Xue Yang seemed to have been able to assemble the missing half. Though Xue Yang was very young, he was extraordinarily smart, sinister, and a follower of all that was heretical. As the Lan Jin clan was surprised to discover, he had been able to construct a crude version of the other half of the Yin Tiger tally, using the surviving half as a reference. Even though the reconstructed Tiger tally was weaker than the original and couldn't be used as long, it was already capable of terrifying feats. Wei Wuxian understood now. The Lan Jin clan wanted to keep Xue Yang alive, so he could continue to restore the Yin Tiger tally for them, so they had to protect him. Perhaps Xue Yang hadn't killed the Chang clan merely to avenge whatever he had suffered in his youth. Perhaps he had also used all those lives to test the precise strength of his restored Yin Tiger tally. No wonder the rumors had connected Wei Wuxian to the massacre. He could almost imagine those cultivators grinding and gnashing their teeth, yelling, "That Wei Wuxian! If he hadn't created that thing, the world would never have suffered so many horrors!" Back to the subject of Jinlin Terrace. Though the Lan Jin clan was determined to protect Xue Yang, neither persuasion nor force could budge Xiao Xingchen. The two sides were completely deadlocked, until finally, news of the situation reached Qi Fengzue, startling him into action. Since Nie Mingjue was not in attendance at the discussion conference, he flew to Jinlin Terrace at top speed to intervene. Though Nie Mingjue was junior to Jin Guangshan, his personality was strict, and he absolutely refused to tolerate, let alone indulge, vile behavior. He excoriated Jin Guangshan for his actions, rendering him speechless and deeply embarrassed. Hot-headed by nature, Nie Mingjue flew into a temper and pulled out his saber with every intention of beheading Xue Yang where he stood. His sworn brother Lian Fangzi and Jin Guangyao rushed in and attempted to smooth things over, but Nie Mingjue roared at him to get out and subjected him to a spate of curses so vicious they practically drew blood. Rattled, Jin Guangyao hid behind Lan Xichen, too frightened to make a sound. In the end, the Lanling Jin clan had no other option but to stand down. From the point where Xiao Xingchen had first captured him and taken him to Jinlin Terrace, Xue Yang had been secure in the knowledge that he had powerful backers. Even with Nie Mingjue's blade pressed against his throat, he still wore a wide grin. Before being taken away, he even spoke affectionately to Xiao Xingchen. "Dao Zhang, you better not forget me. We'll have to wait and see." At this point in the tale, Wei Wuxian knew that these words, "we'll have to wait and see," could only mean Xue Yang intended to make Xiao Xingchen pay an exorbitant and bitter price for his actions. In the meantime, the Lanling Jin clan proved themselves truly worthy of the title of most shameless cultivation clan. Though they had stood in front of all the clans gathered at Jinlin Terrace and promised to dispose of Xue Yang, as soon as Nie Mingjue was out of sight, they hastily sequestered the delinquent in their dungeon and commuted his death sentence into life in prison. Once Nie Mingjue learned of this, he flew into a fury and attempted to twist Jin Guangshan's arm again and force him to give up Xue Yang. But no matter how aggressively Clan Chief Ni pulled or pushed, the Lanling Jin clan refused to produce the boy in question. The other clans did not lift a finger to intervene. Instead, they merely sat back and enjoyed the show. But, to everyone's shock, Nie Mingjue soon suffered a chi deviation and passed away. Of the Qinghe clan's former clan chiefs, his cultivation had grown the quickest, and his death had come the soonest of any of them too. With the passing of their greatest source of difficulty, the Lanling Jin clan grew even more uncontrollable and plotted a scheme even worse than their last. Jin Guangshan brainstormed every method he could to free Xue Yang, so the boy could continue to restore the Yin Tiger tally and investigate its secrets. But at the end of the day, freeing the culprit of an entire clan's massacre was quite ignominious business. They needed a good, proper reason. Thus, they set their sights on Chang Ping. They subjected the chief of the Chang clan to a barrage of threats and promises, and waves upon waves of harassment, and eventually they successfully harangued him into retracting his testimony, retracting all of his grievances against Xue Yang, and declaring that his clan's massacre had nothing to do with him. Upon receiving the news, Xiao Xingchen appeared at Chang Ping's door to inquire about the situation. Chang Ping could only reply, What else could I have done other than that? If I refuse to put up with it, all that remains of my family, every single one of us, our sole remaining path leads only to death. I can't thank you enough, Dao Zhang, but please don't continue to help me. At this point, if you try to help me again, it's the same as trying to hurt me. I don't want the Xue Yang Chang clan to end here. So it went. The tale of the tiger being returned to the mountain had been told. Wei Wuxian was speechless. If he had been Chang Ping, no matter how powerful the Lanling Jin clan was, no matter how much glory and how much splendor anyone promised him, he wouldn't have yielded a single step. Indeed, even if they had the power to hide all of heaven with a single hand, he would have still broken into the dungeon under the cover of night and personally shaved off Xue Yang's flesh bit by bit, until the boy was no more than a puddle of meat slush. Then he would have summoned Xue Yang back from the dead, just to do it again, and again, and again, however many times it took for the bastard to regret ever being born into this world. However, not everyone was like Wei Wuxian. Not everyone would rather die for the sake of revenge than keep on living. A few members of the Chang clan still survived, and Chang Ping was still young. He had no wife or children and had just taken his first steps on the path of cultivation. Whether he was threatened with the lives of his remaining family members or with his future and his cultivation, he had to think carefully about the consequences. At the end of the day, Wei Wuxian was not Chang Ping and could not bear the burden of righteous fury in his place. He was even more unable to shoulder Chang Ping's pain and torment. Sure enough, after Xue Yang was released, he inflicted his vengeance once again, but this time not on Xiao Xingchen's own person. Xiao Xingchen had left the mountain on his own. He had no family. All he had was a close friend he had met after his departure, named Song Lan. Song Lan was also a famous cultivator at the time, with a reputation on par with that of Xiao Xingchen, and a personality that was honest, righteous, and unyielding. The two wanted to establish their own sect together, a sect made of kindred spirits who saw past blood ties. One could say that Xiao Xingchen and Song Lan were the most like-minded and intimate of friends. Xiao Xingchen is the bright moon and the cool breeze. Song Zichen is the brave frost and advancing snow. That was how people of the time described them. Xue Yang chose this friend as his target. Skillfully deploying his old methods, he slew each and every inhabitant of Baixue Temple, where Song Lan had studied since childhood. To this, he stealthily added another crime. Using powdered poison, he blinded Song Lan. This time, Xue Yang had experience. He carried out his massacre perfectly, leaving not a single trail leading back to him. Of course, everyone knew he must have been the culprit, but what good was merely knowing? There was no evidence. On top of that, Jin Guangshan was determined to protect him, and Qi Fengzun and his powerful, thunderous fury had died. Thus, no one could provide a single solution to the problem of Xue Yang, despite everything the boy had done. At this point in the story, Wei Wuxian was suddenly a bit baffled. Though, on the surface, Lan Wangji appeared to treat everything with cold indifference, Wei Wuxian had known him as someone who hated evil with a vengeance, no less than Nie Huaisang's older brother. In the past, when the Lanling Jin clan had done something dishonorable, Lan Wangji had never been shy to offer his blunt opinion. To this day, he hardly ever attended that clan's discussion conferences and absolutely refused to sing their praises. Something as vile as these two massacres must have stirred up the winds and the rain across the entire world of cultivation, and Lan Wangji would never have turned a blind eye to the storm. Why hadn't he dealt with Xue Yang? Just as Wei Wuxian was about to open his mouth and ask, he remembered the whip scars on Lan Wangji's body. A single lash of the discipline whip was enough to threaten a person's life. If Lan Wangji's error was so monumental that it warranted so many, he must have also been forbidden from leaving the cloud recesses for many years. During the time the massacres had taken place, Lan Wangji was probably still in the midst of his punishment or recovering from his wounds. No wonder he could only say that he had heard of the incidents. Wei Wuxian felt an indescribable concern over those scars, but he couldn't exactly open his mouth and ask about them directly. He had no option but to keep a lid on the feeling, for now. So, what happened to Xiao Xingchen Daozhang afterwards? What happened afterwards could not, of course, be anything but the dismal finale. When Xiao Xingchen left his teacher and her mountain, he had promised never to return. He was very much a man of his word, but Song Lan was now blind and heavily injured. Thus, Xiao Xingchen broke his promise. He carried Song Lan back to Baoshan Sanren and begged her to rescue his best friend. In honor of their past relationship as master and disciple, Baoshan Sanren agreed to his request. Xiao Xingchen then went back down the mountain and no one had seen a trace of him since. A year later, Song Lan also left the mountain. To everyone's surprise and wonderment, his eyes, once completely blind, could once again see the light. However, in reality, Baoshan Sanren had not miraculously healed him. Instead, Xiao Xingchen had dug his own eyes out and given them to Song Lan, who had only become entangled in Xue Yang's schemes because of him. In the beginning, Song Lan's desire for vengeance had burned hot and bright, but by that point, Qin Guangshan had already passed away. Qin Kuangyao had taken control of the Lan Lingjin clan and received the title of Chief Cultivator. In order to demonstrate that the winds had changed with his ascent, Qin Guangyao disposed of Xue Yang immediately upon ascending to office, and never again mentioned the restoration of the Yin Tiger tally. Additionally, he took a variety of measures to remedy wrongs and appease the disgruntled, in an effort to restore his clan's popularity, which suppressed any ugly rumors. Thus, Song Lan set off in search of his best friend instead. At first, it was possible to hear tales of the places he had gone, but eventually, news of him ceased too. Moreover, the Xue Yang Chang clan was a small clan of little renown. Consequently, the numerous fires crackling around the Xue Yang affair gradually died into ashes. After hearing this long tale, Wei Wuxian quietly sighed and felt his stomach sink with regret. To end up like that due to something that originally had nothing to do with him, that's seriously... If Xiao Xingchen had been born a few years earlier, or if I had died a few years later, things wouldn't have turned out like this. If I had been alive, something like this would never have been brushed aside, and I would definitely have become friends with the person of his character. Immediately afterward, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He inwardly mocked himself. Me? Take care of the situation? How? If I had been alive back then, they wouldn't have investigated the Chang clan massacre at all. They would have just blamed it on me. If this Xiao Xingchen Daozhang saw me on the road, and I struck up a conversation with him and tried to worm my way into becoming his friend by inviting him out for a drink, he would have probably hit me with his horsetail whisk. Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji had already walked past the Chang house, and were now approaching a nearby cemetery. Upon seeing the dark red Chang written on the archway, Wei Wuxian asked, "So why did Changping die afterwards? Who used the death by 1,000 cuts on the surviving family members?" Just before Lan Wangji could reply, a round of slam, slam, slam echoed through the faint blue twilight. The sound of a hand striking a door. Or rather, it sounded very much like a hand striking a door, but was not. The sound was powerful, violent, hasty, urgent, and, for a period, incessant. But it was also muffled, as though whatever was making it was covered by something. Both of them stared. The 50 or so members of the Xue Yang Chang clan were, at that very moment, lying in their coffins and banging on lids from inside. It was just like the night had died of fright. The strikes were frenzied, frantic, but no one would ever arrive to open the door. This was what the waiter at the liquor shop had been talking about, the sound of people banging on coffins in the Chang clan graveyard. But the waiter had also said that the haunting was 10 years ago and had long since ended. Why would it start again the moment they arrived? Without consulting each other, both Lan Wangji and Wei Wuxian held their breath and sneaked closer. Leaning against the pillar of the archway, they both saw that there was a hole in the middle of the graveyard, amidst the tombstones. The hole was very deep, and fresh dirt was piled up high around it. It was dug recently. Quiet sounds emanated from inside. Someone was digging out a grave. Holding their breaths, attention fixed on the hole, they waited for the person inside to emerge. After about 10 minutes, 2 people leapt out, landing lightly. Fortunately, both Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji's vision were good enough to distinguish 2 figures who appeared almost like conjoined twins. One was carrying the other on his back, and the 2 clung tightly together. Additionally, both were dressed completely in black, making it extremely difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. The long-limbed figure who had leapt up stood with his back turned to Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji, but the head and limbs of the body he carried dangled limply, completely lifeless. However, this was to be expected, as it had been dug out of a grave. Of course it was dead. The fact that it was lifeless was only normal. Just as Wei Wuxian was thinking this, the grave robber suddenly whirled around and saw them. The man's face was shrouded in a thick layer of black fog, completely obscuring his features. Wei Wuxian knew that he must have used some strange magic to hide his appearance. Lan Wangji, having already drawn and brandished Bichen, swept inside the cemetery and attacked. The gravedigger reacted instantly. As soon as he saw the blue light of Bichen's blade flying toward him, he made a hand seal and summoned his own sword. However, just like his face, this sword's light was covered by swirling black fog. It was impossible to see its exact color or form. The gravedigger's fighting style appeared quite strange, as he was still carrying the corpse on his back. The 2 sword lights clashed several times before Lan Wangji called Bichen back. His sword returned to his hand, and a layer of frost advanced rapidly over his face. Wei Wuxian knew why his expression had suddenly turned icy. It was clear, even to an outsider, that his foe, this gravedigger, was intimately familiar with Lan Wangji's style of swordplay. Lan Wangji said nothing, but Bichen's strikes grew more and more forceful, as though the sword was clashing with the mountains and the seas. The gravedigger hurriedly retreated, seemingly aware that, with the corpse on his back, he was no match for Lan Wangji. If he continued fighting, he would inevitably be captured. Abruptly, he dug out a dark blue seal from around his waist. It was a teleportation talisman. This type of talisman could instantly send someone 1,000 kilometers away, but it would also consume a massive amount of spiritual energy, and the user would be forced to waste a great deal of time recovering. Without a sufficient quantity of spiritual power, they wouldn't be able to use the talisman at all. Thus, though teleportation talismans were invaluable objects, very few people actually used them. Seeing that the gravedigger was about to flee, Wei Wuxian hurriedly clapped a couple of times, went down on one knee, and slammed his fist against the ground. The power of his strike penetrated many layers of soil, traveling straight into the depths of the earth. It bore through the thick lids of the Chang clan's coffins, stirring the dead trapped inside into a near frenzy. Several cracks sounded, and 4 blood-drenched arms rose from the ground, ferociously seizing the gravedigger's left and right legs. But the gravedigger seemed unconcerned. He directed his spiritual energy to his feet and blasted away the undead hands. Wei Wuxian pulled out his flute, and a sharp, mournful tune shredded through the descending curtain of night. 2 heads burst through the graveyard's earth, and the rest of their bodies soon followed. The corpses pulled themselves up the gravedigger's leg and wound themselves around his body like a pair of snakes. Opening their jaws, they prepared to bite down on his arms and neck. The gravedigger let out an irritated, disdainful groan, as though to say, amateurish. He sent his spiritual energy coursing through his entire body, but this time, after blasting away the corpses, he suddenly realized he'd been tricked. He had also sent the corpse on his back flying. Wei Wuxian smacked the nearest tombstone, howling with laughter. Meanwhile, Lan Wangji stuck out a hand and caught the floppy, soft body. With his other hand, he raised Bichen and began another assault. The gravedigger realized his freshly unearthed corpse had already been stolen. He was unable to defeat Lan Wangji on his own, and on top of all that, there was another person playing tricks on him. Thus, he dared not stay much longer. He flung the teleportation talisman at his feet, and after a loud boom, blue flames unfurled and flew skywards. His figure disappeared amidst the fire. Wei Wuxian knew from early on that the gravedigger was holding a teleportation talisman. Even if they had caught him, he would have found the opportunity to escape. But seizing the corpse he had unearthed meant seizing a clue, so Wei Wuxian did not have regrets about the gravedigger's escape. He walked over to Lan Wangji and said, "Let's see who he dug up." A small spark of astonishment hit him as soon as he glanced at the body. Its skull had already been torn open, but no slush of blood and brain tissue leaked out. Instead, poking out of the hole were round balls of cotton, which had begun to blacken. Wei Wuxian pulled on the head, and it easily came off. "What's going on? Why is there a fake corpse made of rags and cotton?" he asked, holding up the exquisitely made false head. Having held the body and felt its weight in his hand, Lan Wangji already knew something was strange.
"It is not entirely fake."
Wei Wuxian groped around the corpse for a bit and discovered that all of its 4 limbs were squishy. Only its chest and abdomen were stiff and felt like they belonged to a real corpse. After ripping off its clothes, he discovered that, indeed, the torso was a real torso, but otherwise, the remaining parts of the body were fake. The cotton limbs and head had been used to trick the torso into thinking its other parts were still attached. Based on the appearance of the torso's skin and the severed flesh on its left shoulder, where its arm would have been, it could only belong to their good friend. The gravedigger had indeed come to dig him up. Wei Wuxian rose. "It seems whoever's been hiding the corpse parts already noticed that we're investigating the situation. He came to move the torso because he was afraid we'd uncover it. Arriving early isn't nearly as good as arriving at just the right time, eh? He ran into us at precisely the wrong moment." "But," the tone of his voice changed, "how come the fog-faced gravedigger was so familiar with your clan's fighting style?" Obviously, Lan Wangji was contemplating this question too. The layer of frost covering his face had yet to retreat. "His cultivation level is pretty high enough to support his use of the teleportation talisman," Wei Wuxian continued. "He also cast a spell on his face and sword. It's easy to understand why he'd do it to his face. He was afraid someone would recognize him, of course. But usually, no-name cultivators don't need to use magic to mask their swords. Unless his sword is at least a little famous. Or maybe even very famous. If a lot of people are familiar with the light of his blade, then brandishing it would immediately unmask him. He'd have no choice but to cover it up. Han Guangjun, you fought him a moment ago. Do you think he's someone you're familiar with?" Wei Wuxian probed. Because of the matter's delicacy, he couldn't speak more precisely than that. For example, he couldn't ask if the gravedigger could be Lan Xichen or Lan Qiren.
"No."
Lan Wangji answered confidently. Wei Wuxian had a great deal of faith in Lan Wangji's reply. He didn't think that Lan Wangji was the type of person who would hide from or refuse to face the truth. If he said the gravedigger wasn't someone close to him, then that was the end of the story, and he also disliked lying. The way Wei Wuxian saw it, Lan Wangji would rather cast a silencing spell on himself than speak a deliberate falsehood. Thus, Wei Wuxian immediately ruled out the 2 people he had been thinking of previously. "This makes things even more complicated," he said. Lan Wangji placed the torso inside another 2-layered evil-sealing Qiankun pouch and tucked it away carefully. He and Wei Wuxian circled around the area a few times, then leisurely made their way back to the liquor street. The waiter had indeed been true to his word. A great majority of the liquor stores lining the street had already closed, but his store sign was still up, and the lights were still glowing. The man himself was outside, shoveling food into his mouth from a massive, ocean-sized bowl.
"You're back!"
he said delightedly upon seeing them.
"What do you think? We're an establishment that keeps our word, right? Did you two see anything?"
Laughing, Wei Wuxian said a few words in reply. Then, he and Lan Wangji sat down at the same table they had occupied during the day. Jars of alcohol were piled from Wei Wuxian's feet all the way up to the table. Oh, right. Where were we earlier? The sudden appearance of that gravedigger interrupted us. I still don't know how Changping died. Lan Wangji continued telling the story in his extremely succinct, flat, and unadorned style. Xue Yang, Xiao Xingchen, Song Lan, and other figures in the story continued exiting the stage. Those who had vanished, vanished, and those who had died, died. One day, several years after the events surrounding the Chang clan's massacre, the surviving members were murdered in a single night, their bodies sliced to pieces through the death by 1,000 cuts. And, on top of that, Changping's eyes had been dug straight out from his head. Who the culprit was this time, no one managed to discover. After all, everyone involved in the original sequence of events had all died or vanished. However, there was one thing they could verify. The sword, which had been used to inflict the death by 1,000 cuts, as confirmed by the wounds, was none other than Xiao Xingchen's own sword, Xuanhua. Wei Wuxian froze, just as the bowl of liquor he was holding reached his lips, stunned by this information. The death by 1,000 cuts was inflicted by Xiao Xingchen's sword? Does that mean he was the culprit?
All signs of Xiao Xingchen have disappeared. It is impossible to reach a verdict,
Lan Wangji said. Since no one's been able to find him alive, has anyone tried summoning his soul?
Yes. No result.
No result. That either meant he wasn't dead, or the pieces of his soul had been scattered to the winds. As a specialist in this area, Wei Wuxian had to give his opinion on the matter. You can't talk about things like summoning souls in an absolute manner. Nothing can be dispensed with, not the place, the time, the person, or the skies. Everything has to be in perfect harmony, and even then, sometimes a mistake will still happen. I guess a lot of people believe the murder of the remaining Changs were Xiao Xingchen's revenge, right? Han Guangjun, what about you? What do you think? Lan Wangji shook his head slowly.
Without the complete picture, I cannot comment.
Wei Wuxian deeply admired his friend's attitude, his principles, and his way of handling affairs. Beaming, he drank another mouthful of liquor. He heard Lan Wangji speak again.
What is your opinion?
The death by 1,000 cuts is a type of torture, Wei Wuxian replied. It signifies punishment. In any case, digging out Changping's eyes made the association with Xiao Xingchen unavoidable, since his eyes were dug out the same way. So, the speculation that it was Xiao Xingchen's revenge is understandable. However, he took a second to think about how to word things. In my opinion, Xiao Xingchen hadn't gotten involved in order to win Changping's gratitude. So He had yet to think through exactly what he would say following the "I," when the waiter very hospitably sent over 2 small platters of peanuts. The interruption just so happened to spare him from continuing his previous thought. Lifting his eyes and looking at Lan Wangji, he smiled and said, "Wangji, why are you looking at me like that? I don't have much of an opinion. I also don't know the whole story, so I can't comment just like you. What you said was very true. Until we understand the whole sequence of events and know every relevant piece of information, we shouldn't be jumping to hasty conclusions. I only asked for 5 jars, but you bought me an extra 5 on top of that. I'm afraid I won't be able to finish them myself. How about it? Drink with me? This isn't the cloud recesses after all, so you won't be violating the ban on alcohol, right? Wei Wuxian was already prepared to hear his offer flatly rejected, and had no idea that Lan Wangji would reply,
Yes.
Han Guangjun, you've really changed, Wei Wuxian said, clicking his tongue. I once drank a small jar in front of you, and you were so furious you threw me over the wall. You also hit me. But now, you've even started hiding jars of Emperor Smile in your room and drinking in secret. Lan Wangji fixed the front of his robes.
I have never touched a single jar of Emperor Smile,
he said quietly. Why hide it if you aren't drinking it? What, you kept them to give to me? All right. If you haven't touched it, you haven't touched it. I'm not allowed to believe you. I won't bring it up again. Come on, I have to see the exact number of cups it takes to get a teetotaling disciple of the Guosu Lan clan falling down drunk. He poured a bowl for his friend. Without even thinking about it, Lan Wangji took it and downed the whole thing. Wei Wuxian felt an indescribable excitement and scrutinized his face to see when it would start turning red. To his surprise, he didn't see even the tiniest change in color, even after a long period of observation. Lan Wangji's pale irises gazed calmly and attentively back at Wei Wuxian. Not a single thing about him had changed. Greatly disappointed, Wei Wuxian was just about to coax his friend into drinking another jar, when suddenly Lan Wangji frowned and lightly rubbed the space between his eyebrows. After a moment, he laid his forehead on his hand and closed his eyes. He fell asleep? He fell asleep! After most people drank so much alcohol, they became drunk first, then fell asleep. Why had Lan Wangji skipped over the drunk phase entirely and gone straight to sleeping? The drunk phase was what Wei Wuxian wanted to see. He waved his hand in front of the solemn and upstanding, even when sleeping face of Lan Wangji, then clapped his hands a few times next to his friend's ears. No response. Shockingly, Lan Wangji was an incredible lightweight, the kind that was knocked out by a single bowl. Wei Wuxian had no idea this would happen. He slapped his leg, thought for a moment, then curled Lan Wangji's right arm around his neck and fitfully hauled him away from the store. Having long since become adept at snatching things off Lan Wangji's person, Wei Wuxian pulled out his friend's wallet, found an inn, and rented 2 rooms. He brought him inside one of the rooms, removed his boots, and tucked him in, then took advantage of the dark night to slip out. Wei Wuxian strolled to a desolate, secluded area outside of town. When he arrived, he pulled out the bamboo flute at his waist, placed it by his lips, and played a tune. Then he waited in silence. He and Lan Wangji had spent each and every day side by side recently, and Wei Wuxian had had no time to himself. Thus, he had been bereft of opportunities to summon Wen Ning. He had avoided doing so in his friend's presence, partly because of his earlier desire to conceal his identity. But there was another reason too. Wen Ning had the blood of Guosu Lan clan disciples on his hands. No matter how well Lan Wangji treated Wei Wuxian, he couldn't summon Wen Ning in front of him. Or rather, it was because Lan Wangji had treated him so well that Wei Wuxian wasn't shameless enough as to summon Wen Ning in front of his face. No matter how impervious he was to shame generally, it didn't extend to his type of situation. By the time he left his reverie, deep clinks and clangs were already echoing in his ears. Head lowered, Wen Ning's silhouette appeared beneath the shadow of the town walls. He was dressed from head to toe in lacquer black, dissolving into the darkness around him, except his pupilless eyes, which were a painful, blinding white. Malevolent white. Wei Wuxian placed his hands behind his back and slowly circled around Wen Ning. The fierce corpse shifted, as though he wanted to turn and follow Wei Wuxian's movements. "Stand still," Wei Wuxian said. Thus, Wen Ning stood still and motionless. His delicate, pretty features seemed to grow dejected. "Hand," Wei Wuxian said. The fierce corpse held out his right hand. Wei Wuxian grabbed his wrist and lifted it, then carefully examined the iron cuff encircling his arm and the iron chains which dangled below it. These were anything but ordinary chains. A frenzied Wen Ning was extremely powerful and violent, and could wring steel into slush with his bare hands. He would never have allowed the fetters to remain on his body like this. Unfortunately, the chains had most likely been specifically created to shackle Wen Ning. Crush his bones and scatter his ashes? Some clans had even attempted to restore the Yin Tiger tally, as destructive an instrument as it was. So of course, they'd also drool over the prospect of having the ghost general in their possession. How could they have been willing to crush his bones and scatter his ashes? Wei Wuxian let out a cold laugh. Standing to Wen Ning's side, he thought for a bit, then stuck his hand into the ghost general's hair and slowly began pressing at his scalp. The people who had locked Wen Ning up and kept him around certainly couldn't have let him act in accordance with his own free will. In order to make him obey others' orders, they had to destroy his consciousness, so they must have done something to his head. As expected, on the third press, Wei Wuxian felt something small and hard on the right side of Wen Ning's skull, right on one of his energy points. He placed his other hand on the corresponding point on the left side of Wen Ning's head, and indeed, found another small and hard object. They felt like the tail ends of a pair of needles. Pinching both needle ends at the same time, Wei Wuxian slowly pulled two long, black nails from the inside of Wen Ning's skull. The two nails were about the length of a thumb, the thickness of the red ropes used in jade pendants, and had been buried deep inside Wen Ning's head. The moment the nails left his skull, Wen Ning's features began to tremble, and a layer of black, blood vessel-like threads began to creep out over his wide eyes. He appeared to be in agony. Though Wen Ning was undoubtedly dead, he could very much still feel suffering and similar things. Fine and intricate patterns were carved onto the two nails, which were clearly of extraordinary origin. The person who had made them was certainly no mean talent. Wei Wuxian would have to wait quite a while for Wen Ning's recovery. He tucked the nails away, lowered his head, and looked at the chains around the fierce corpse's wrists and ankles. It would be no good for Wen Ning to continue dragging the noisy shackles around, he thought. He would have to find a cultivator's sword and chop them off. Naturally, the first thing he thought of was Lan Wangji's bichen. Even though it was a bit inappropriate to use the sword of someone from the Lan clan to help Wen Ning remove his chains, it was the easiest sword for him to get a hold of. Plus, it wasn't like he could just let Wen Ning drag such cumbersome things around. How about this? Wei Wuxian thought to himself. I'll go back to the inn now. If Lan Zhen's awake when I get there, I won't touch bichen. If Lan Zhen's still sleeping, then I'll borrow bichen to use for a bit. Having made his decision, he turned around. Who could have guessed he would find Lan Wangji standing right behind him?